What if we could make a 3D model of this diagram of the Lagrange points in JWST's orbit around L2? Would that help us explain it? I mean, we can add some arrows showing the direction of pull and color code our electronic tinker toys with the sun's pull yellow and the Earth's pull blue. And it is a little easier to understand the ball on a string analogy when we can see both the strings pulling on JWST. But 3D animation adds another dimension to visualizing JWST's path relative to the sun: velocity. But we won't start with JWST's velocity. We'll get back to that. We'll start with Earth's. Of course, if this Earth orbit was to scale, Earth would barely be a pixel, and the sun would be just a bit bigger and a good bit brighter than our phony background stars. And the distance from Earth to L2 would only be 1/93rd the distance from Earth to Sun. Even putting the 3D model in motion makes us stretch to grasp that the Earth and all of its Lagrange points are traveling around the Sun at over 86 times the speed of sound. Phew! So remember that big V, velocity times mass equals momentum, and momentum is what drives all objects in space. Gravity merely bends their path. Yes, these water drops look motionless inside this spacecraft, but the craft is going Mach 20-something around Earth and Mach 86 around the sun. And by the way, that's moving too, but that's a totally different problem. So, before we launch our model JWST, let's look at what is going on here at one of the stable Lagrange points, L5. We have sun pull and Earth pull lines meeting at L5 and the green box we put there, and not meeting at another green box near L5. Like Earth, our green boxes have velocity arrows, but the size is just for looks. The velocity of the object at L5 is exactly the same over Mach 86 speed of Earth. Of course, if an object just appeared at L5 with no orbital velocity, it would fall towards the sun, leaning to the earthward side at first, maybe enough to miss and catch a slingshot around the sun, maybe not. Gravity weakens with distance, so we're keeping the pull lines pointing at the object near L5 the same 93 million miles long as the lines to L5 itself, and that's why their ends don't meet. So let's be the box near L5 just to keep our boxes straight. In our initial position, we're going faster than Earth because we're inside Earth's orbit, and our orbital speed increases when our distance from the sun decreases. But here, because the gentle braking action from Earth's pull fades as we accelerate away, we cross Earth's orbital path, and that makes us slow down. Even though our pull lines are having their weakest effect, we still have some outward momentum, increasing our distance from the sun, slowing us further, and the box at L5 passes us on the inside because we're going just a few miles per hour slower than it is. By now, we're going about as slow as we're going to get because the sun's pull is going to bend our path more sunward, making us cross Earth's orbital path again and begin to speed back up. Even the Earth's strongest pull backwards does nothing more here than to keep us from racing away as we glide by, just a couple miles per hour faster than L5. Now, if we change our viewpoint to see all of Earth's too small orbit, we can see that these breadcrumbs we've been leaving in our path made just one orbit around L5 in a year. So what if we make it orbit L5 faster? JWST only does 2 orbits a year around L2 prime, so 8 laps a year sounds like breaking the law, and it does a great job of showing the slow part of a lap versus the fast part. Of course, I'm only going to put in 4 of those loops because this is a really tedious process putting these breadcrumbs in. One more note about scale: just as our objects are crazy out of scale, so are our Lagrange point orbits. The curvy path of breadcrumbs our box left might be no wider than just one of the breadcrumbs itself. So the changes in direction that our object is making are far more subtle than our virtual tinker toy can demonstrate. And that brings us to our JWST diagram model. It's easy to understand a powerful rocket pushing a satellite out there a million miles, but once we get it out there and it bends to the left, what force makes it go into its loop back to the right? Is it really like a pendulum making circles at the end of a string? Well, first we have to mention scale again. Let's put a marker under L2 in our starting frame and then jump to frame 2. We've rotated our virtual toy 2.13 degrees and added a second marker. My calculator says that 2.13 degrees is about 2.16 Earth days, which means Earth has traveled just over 3.45 million miles. I read that JWST's orbit around L2 is about 1 million miles wide, so this orbit ought to fit inside that imaginary pink ball at L2. Our clown-sized toy just makes it easier to see. And it won't affect our 30-day time lapse from launch to insertion. As you can see, the trail of breadcrumbs JWST leaves does resemble the diagram, but much like a drop of water in a space capsule, while the rocket takes JWST almost 1 million miles to L2 prime, JWST, Earth, Moon, and all 10 of their combined Lagrange points have traveled 50+ million miles in that same 30 days. And now, at long last, the ball on a string analogy actually has a chance to apply. JWST's insertion burn left it going just a bit slower than Earth, so it's falling back. But the steep angle of Earth's pull is also pulling it north by Earth coordinates. As it falls back, the Earth's pull and the Sun's, to a much lesser extent, starts urging JWST forward, speeding it up. Previous momentum carries it further north even as the southward pull starts to build, and the forward pull accelerates JWST past Earth. At the same time, the building southward pull gets JWST headed south again as the braking action on its forward orbital motion starts to build. And it begins to slow down when that pull reaches its peak and its southward momentum starts to get countered by a growing northward pull, and that brings us back around to where we were after our insertion burn, with that lap around L2 taking about 6 months. Now, as we watch some alternate views of this scene, let me speculate about the most glossed over point in my presentation, the insertion and station keeping burns. I know I read that JWST's orbit of L2 also ranges in distance from Earth from 500,000 miles to just short of the 1 million miles to L2. I believe the station keeping burns are done around the same place as the insertion burn, and that the thrust is mostly outwards towards L2 and up the slope of that potato chip we heard so much about, with just enough forward vector on that thrust in relation to Earth's orbit to make sure it passes Earth before gliding back down the other side of the potato chip. Just remember that potato chip gravity balance point is moving at Mach 86 plus. Even if that is a given they don't have to factor in, it sure helps to get your head around it when you see that JWST is never going backwards. It's just changing its pace versus Earth. This is my understanding of the math. I am hoping for feedback from someone who actually has experience doing that kind of math. I hope it helped you visualize what's going on out there. Thanks.